Guys, we're going to do another episode of Bad Bible Tweets. And so this one comes from a gentleman named Trey Ferguson. It says, God never condones polygamy, though. Really? So you're calling Nathan the prophet a liar? Because in 2 Samuel 12:8, he says God gave David all them wives and would have given him more if he asked. The Bible says elders can't have more than one wife, yes, but the rest of us? And so now he's not trying to promote polygamy, I'm pretty sure, just from seeing a few of his other tweets, but he's trying to undermine this idea that we can come up with this biblical idea of marriage that transcends culture. And in other words, seeing marriage as a cultural construct itself. And so it opens up the doors to all these other definitions of marriage, I think is his main goal here. But is this good hermeneutics? And the answer, my friends, is of course not. First of all, let's look at the passage itself, 2 Samuel 12:8. He says, I also gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your care. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added many more things like these. So the first thing I want to do with this passage right here is create some tension with it. And so if I was to jump over to Deuteronomy 17:17, the king is quite literally told, he shall not multiply wives for himself, otherwise his heart will turn away. And so this obviously happens to Solomon. And I take multiply here to say many, but it's many is what's going on in our passage as well. So is God contradicting his law here? And the answer is, of course not. That's not what's going on in the passage. This is not some kind of condoning what the law forbid, okay? And this isn't some kind of, the law at places does make tolerance for man's fallenness and sinfulness that does go against the archetype, the high standard of Genesis. That does happen in the law. We know that from the Lord in Matthew 19, and we'll get to that in a bit. But this isn't a contradiction here. What God is simply saying in the passage is it would be like if my son stole from a Snicker bar from a gas station, and I said to my son, why would you do that? We have snacks at home. I said, and if you wanted more snacks, I would have bought you a whole bag of Snicker bars. Like, why on earth would you need to steal that? Now, am I saying when I say that, hey, it's good to eat a whole bag of Snicker bars? Like, of course not. Am I saying Snicker bars are healthy for you? No, of course not. It's just saying that so extreme was your lust and your desire, whatever was going on in your heart, to have that thing, that it made you irrational. It has somehow dominated you. And so, in other words, like, there's all these lawful ways, King David, for you to go about, dealing with these urges you have. But you decided to do it in a way that violated the commandment around adultery, that violated the commandment about desiring your neighbor's wife and taking Uriah's wife for yourself, and then going on to murder Uriah. You managed to violate 3 of the 10 commandments in the way you went about this, and yet there are all these lawful ways for you to do it. That's the point. That's all it is. And more importantly than that, when we think about how to interpret the Bible, where we're at in our place in redemptive history is extremely important. And so Genesis 1 and 2 play a key part in hermeneutic and how we interpret the Bible. Think about this. If I look at Genesis 1:27, and it says God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Is this verse important for us for how we think about every human being having intrinsic value, that we have in some sense all equal dignity and worth? Absolutely it is. I think everybody would agree with that. Well, these same verses are not only the foundation for the value of the individual, but they're also the same verses that are the value of marriage and family. And so you can't just pick and choose which ones you want to be valuable to you. These verses are foundational. But why are they foundational? It's because of where they're located at in the Bible. This is Genesis. This is part of God's good creation. It shows his intention and his design and is a reflection of his goodness, and it happens before the fall. When I go to Genesis chapter 2 and I scroll down to the point where he creates the woman and he brings her to him, we have the language of covenant here with bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. We have marriage covenant taking place here. We see the man speaking Hebrew poetry to the woman. The God, Yahweh, as a father, walks his bride down the aisle, brings her to the man, if you will. But more importantly than probably all of those pieces right there is that in the text of Genesis 2 itself, it stops in the narrative and says, this isn't just about the first man and woman. This is the reason why we do this thing called marriage. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And so the text of Genesis 2 exegetes it for us and says this is the pattern for marriage. And so marriage, the idea that we look to Genesis as the archetype for what marriage should be, is entirely correct because of where it is in redemptive history. Now, there's this other really important place we can go for importance in redemptive history, and it has to do with the coming of the Christ. It has to do with the fullness of God in bodily form. No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has revealed him. And so we have the fullness and complete revelation of who God is in the person of Jesus Christ. And does he speak to marriage? Yes, he does. And what does he appeal to when he does that? He appeals to God's good creation and intention and design, and he does it to correct the cultural notions that they had created in their society around divorce. In other words, he can correct the cultural understanding and interpretation of what marriage is using Genesis. The Messiah himself, the Redeemer himself, who raises us up to heights beyond Genesis 1 and 2, does this. And so when we say that we're appealing to this idea for marriage in the Bible, we're actually practicing a supreme hermeneutic here, looking at the redemptive history of the Bible, looking at God's intention and design in creation, and then looking at the Messiah with the heavenly revelation, the fullness of God and his teaching on it. And they both are saying the same thing. And so he quotes this passage that we read there in Genesis authoritatively. Not only that, he's not just reflecting a cultural idea, but he's correcting their interpretation of the law. And he's in a sense, he's out proof texting them. You got Deuteronomy 24. Well, I got Genesis 2. And they would have understood what he's doing here is that this is the foundation, okay, for which the others can make sense. And he even tells them here that he goes, well, why did God tolerate these things in the law? It's like, well, this isn't a permission. This isn't a command. Like they go, why did Moses command to give it away? He said, he's permitting it. He's tolerating it because your hardness of heart. And that's true. If you go read the law, there's lots of laws in there that had this idea of just restraining evil. And it wasn't trying to necessarily promote, hey, this is the way that this thing is supposed to look like. But it was a restraining of evil. And so that's what's going on here. I remember reading Matthew Henry's commentary talking about when they're off at war, if there was a woman that caught their eye, they had to go through this whole entire process of before making them their wife. In other words, they couldn't just sleep with them on the battlefield. It was guarding against this idea of raping and pillaging and those type of things. And they even had to shave their head and mourn the loss of their family and do all these type of things. Well, like why would God make them go through that? Well, it would make them sober-mindedly decide whether that was something they really wanted or not. Remove the woman's beauty, right? In the process, wait a period of time so you're not making decisions off those urges. And Matthew Henry, commenting on that passage, said this is clearly another law that's put in place because of the hardness of men's hearts. The idea that you see a woman and you want to marry her based off that simple desire is not godly. And I think he's right. I think that's another example of God restraining evil with the law, is why some of those laws existed. And so am I going to go to a narrative in 2 Samuel in a flawed king, lots of good in David's life, but a flawed king, and at his lowest point in his life, and him getting rebuked and say, this rebuke from Nathan the prophet in the redemptive history of Israel is going to trump the creation archetype and trump the Redeemer's application of that in the New Testament? Like, absolutely not. Like, I'll stick with this hermeneutic that looks at the whole of redemptive history, God's intended design, his redeemed purpose in the Messiah, and we will interpret the rest through that lens. And so I think it's here's another thing you can do too. We have a whole video on this, but you can go to Genesis 4 and you can see where the archetype, the architecture of polygamy comes from. It comes from a man named Lamech. And Lamech took for himself 2 wives, it says right there. And what's significant about Lamech is that he is the final figure in that by name in the line of the seed of the serpent, Cain. And he's typifying going from bad to worse. And he boasts about how he will avenge himself. God will avenge Cain, but I'll avenge myself 7 times more than God can. And this is a big deal to boast before the judge of all the earth, who had just kicked mankind out of the garden not that long ago. And so this same phrase here, the 70 times, this is 70 times 7 in the Greek Septuagint. It's what Jesus quotes in the New Testament to talk about forgiveness. So he is using it. Lamech is using it to talk about vengeance. Jesus uses the phrase to speak about forgiveness, just to show you how backward Lamech is, okay? And so he's the last named figure before the flood. And so there's your archetype for polygamy. Is that who you want to throw in your lot with? Of course not. So we're ranking this one bad Bible tweet. It's a shoddy exegesis, one that he doesn't even believe in himself. And so don't take exegetical advice and arguments from guys who don't believe their own interpretation, number one. But don't let them try sometimes people who are trying to argue against the fidelity to Scripture will just fire as many shots as they can against a position, hoping that one sticks. But this one doesn't stick, so they'll have to keep firing. Thanks for watching.